going to be talking this morning from, this is the series, the Summer of Psalms, Summer in the Psalms, and this morning is going to be Psalm 74, and I'm calling it a daring prayer. And we're going to look through that this morning. I'm basically going to just talk to you about a couple things, introducing sort of what the underlying context of where the psalm came from. Talk a little bit about what the psalm actually says, and then sort of invite us to reflect on how that prayer can look in our lives too, how we can sort of enter into that same prayer. Start by maybe getting some thoughts from you. What do you think of when you think of chaos? What's like an image or description that you think of when you think of chaos? A class of kindergartens. Yep. I know you experienced that. My wife, Louisa, is well acquainted with that as well as an EA in the school board. What else comes to mind when you think of chaos? Mess. Yep. Yeah, everyone's doing their own thing. Unrest, I heard. Sorry? The aftermath of a storm. Sort of a sense of destruction or, yeah. Excellent. Yeah, and these are all really good examples. The term itself, chaos, literally comes out of it's a Greek word that basically just means a void or an emptiness, a gap, like, the gap between when I see this thing, a kindergarten class or scatteredness, there's a gap between that and what I think it should be. There should be order or rest or togetherness. So that this gap between or an event that's empty of order. That's what we call chaos. And we all at times experience chaos in our lives. Whether it's unrest and scatteredness or whether it's a sense of, again, the literal sense of just emptiness. There should be something here, but there isn't. We all experience chaos, and that's not always a bad experience to have or a bad place to be. You can't get 2 sentences into the Bible without noticing that God's new creation comes into these empty places. God's new work begins in chaos or what seems like scatteredness and disunity. And that's perhaps why when we think of spiritual disciplines in our lives, our sort of posturing and practicing ourselves to be filled with or transformed by our Creator. Like the core of all those spiritual disciplines is probably the emptying of ourselves. Until that happens, until we sort of make a space in our lives for God to work and redo and remake, until we sort of offer up an empty space, all the other disciplines and activities we can participate in can just become a bunch more stuff, a bunch more work or words or efforts. Right, so getting into an empty space, ceasing to try to just make something of ourselves and put pieces together ourselves, and learning to trust that the Spirit is always there, hovering and ready to bring new life into that empty space. So again, the feeling of emptiness or scatteredness or incompleteness, the feeling of chaos is not always a bad thing, and it can be a very, very good thing. Nevertheless, it'd be silly to not acknowledge that it's also not a very nice place to be sometimes. We can't remain in emptiness or chaos for too long, right? It can be difficult to live and even pray in chaos, especially when the things that once sort of held together and symbolized, stability and direction and purpose in our lives are gone for too long. We can lack that reminder and reassurance and clarity of God's presence. That's important to begin with, because Psalm 74 this morning is really a prayer that comes out of chaos, but ultimately turns to the hope of God's Spirit, our King, Jesus, putting together and reweaving and reworking those disparate pieces in our lives. So we're going to look at Psalm 74. Again, I'm calling it a daring prayer from a community in chaos, a community left in the void. And three things that we can just keep in mind as we get into the psalm. First of all, just noticing what the people praying this prayer were experiencing. Just paying attention to what's really going on in their lives, because the more we understand them, the more we will probably see ourselves, even in our very different context, the more we will see ourselves in a similar place. We can relate to what these prayers are going through. And secondly, just keeping in mind, pay attention to how did they pray. Just really, what was the flow? What was the model that they are presenting to us in their prayer? And thirdly, where does their prayer lead them, and where will it lead us together? To really get and understand what the psalm says, let's offer a little bit of background. And this should be relatively painless. If you're not a history person, this is totally fine. You can go to that next slide. Thank you, Eric. So think of the year 600 or so BC. So 2,600 years ago, the world did not look quite the same way as it does now. And a nation, an empire, the Babylonian Empire, started to move west and south as they expanded towards Jerusalem. Forgive the fact that the arrow's pointing that way. That's representing where the Israelites ended up, the Judeans ended up. But Babylon started spreading west and south, and you can see what lies directly in their path. So here comes a major world power set on conquering, and in spite of prophetic warnings that Jerusalem will be overthrown, Jerusalem's going to get captured by the Babylonians, God's word came and said this is going to happen. In spite of that warning, the king of Judah decides, I'm going to fight back anyway. You ever have that urge, even if the writing's on the wall, and you just have to still So he fights back with his army. Does not go very well. In 2 Kings 25, we get the sort of play-by-play of what happened. I'll just read it to you. It's not going to be up on the screen. It says here, in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, the king of Judah, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. He encamped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. Quick math. Siege began in the 9th year and lasts until the 11th year. How many years were they under siege? 2. Thereabouts. By the 9th day of the 4th month, and by the way, siege, you know what that is. It's like basically cutting off of the lifelines. Everything inside of that circle of an army just is left. You don't get in or out. So by the 9th day of the 4th month, the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. And some of us, it's hard to go 2 hours without some kind of sustenance to refill us. And imagine 2 years of this ongoing siege. And this is where we get passages like in Lamentations 4, where again the prophet is lamenting what's going on. Passages like, because of thirst, the infant's tongue sticks to the roof of its mouth. The children beg for bread, but no one can give it to them. Those who once ate delicacies are destitute in the streets. There's no food or water left, so the people become desperate. And finally, after 2 years of this, we read that King Nebuchadnezzar sends his army in for a final blow. So we read, on the 7th day of the 5th month, in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, he sent the commander of the imperial guard, an official of the king of Babylon, was sent to Jerusalem. And he set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Every important building he burned down. This is not just a bad day. This is complete and utter destruction. And not just of a home or a community center, but for the people of God, a complete and utter destruction of the temple, of the place on earth that was designed and built to represent God's presence on earth, to represent God's plan for the earth. It is destroyed and done away with. The whole Babylonian army, under the commander of the imperial guard, broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Not just, let's take out the temple and take out the houses. Let's just remove the whole thing. And Nebuchadnezzar, the commander of the guard, carried into exile, so you get brought somewhere else, the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had deserted to the king of Babylon. So if you didn't die, you were left there, and you were like, now I'll join up with you, king of Babylon. They get brought out of the city into exile. But the commander left behind some of the poorest people of the land to work the vineyards and the fields. So do you get sort of a mental image of what's going on here? The city's destroyed, the temple is destroyed, the king and the army have fled and deserted. The people who were left alive that deserted to the king of Babylon are gone, and what's left behind is a completely destroyed city and the poorest of the poor who are left behind just to take care of the fields. So this is the kind of context that this psalm arises from. And as we start to read it, can you, and I don't know if we can really relate, unless you've experienced just utter catastrophe in your life, but can you relate somewhat to the place that these now left behind people are in? Right? Your guardians, the guardians that you thought you could rely on, have deserted and fled in battle. The strong people and the rulers that you thought you could rely on are gone. The structures that they returned to, that they formed their lives around, that gave them some sense of purpose and direction, they're all gone. And what's left behind is a community of broken, confused, poor people with a daring prayer. And there's a real, rawness at that point. This is one of the things, and I don't think this happened this morning at all, but, in church, we can sort of have very civilized, sort of well-articulated, well-worded prayers. But when you meet with someone who's really at the bottom, who's really broken up, you can get a whole different flavor. This raw, vulnerable, desperate, and again, even daring prayer. We could be willing to say even rather impious words as they arise out of brokenness. And so let's read their prayer. This is Psalm 74. And just notice a few pieces that come to us. And for those who want to create some mental space ahead of time, there's going to be 4 main parts to the prayer. And because this is a sermon, they all start with R. If we're going to look at 4 things that these left behind people pray. And let's start off with, again, that raw, vulnerable, "Oh God, why have you rejected us forever? Why does your anger smolder against the sheep of your pasture? We were supposed to be your people. Why have you rejected us? Why does your anger smolder against the sheep of your pasture? Remember the nation you purchased long ago, the people of your inheritance who you redeemed, and Mount Zion where you dwelt." The first thing they do, besides this very raw, probably explosive question, "Why have you rejected us?" The very first thing they do is remember the past. In the midst of chaos, in the midst of emptiness, when there's nothing left to turn to, when the pieces that you would normally have turned to are gone or scattered, when the present gives nothing to stand on, we can remember, recall, retell the past. And this can give us something to hold on to. Remember, God, the people that you have redeemed, the inheritance who you purchased, and Mount Zion where you dwelt. Remember that we were not always a scattered and broken people. Why can it be hard to remember in the midst of chaos? And you don't even have to answer that out loud, but when you're in the midst of just confusion, when the pieces that were all part of that story are now gone, it can be quite difficult to remember. The reminders and the symbols aren't there. The storytellers maybe aren't there. The people you shared that story with maybe are not there. But the prayers do their best to remember. But they don't stay there. The verses 3 to 11, we're going to read them, says this. So again, remember this nation that you purchased, this inheritance that you redeemed, this city on Mount Zion that you dwelt in. Remember it. Now turn your steps towards the everlasting ruins. It's like saying to God, remember that you built this place? Remember that you redeemed us and brought us into this place? Now come with me as I show you what's happened to it. This is the reality right now. The city is in everlasting ruins. All this destruction the enemy has brought onto your sanctuary. Your foes have roared in a place where you met with us. They set up their standards as signs. They set up their symbols instead of yours. They behaved like men wielding axes to cut through a thicket of trees. I had to chuckle at this one because I've done this a couple times in the last few weeks. That sort of just relentless chopping away at, in my case, it was kind of shrubbery. It wasn't trees. We share a back fence with the McDonald's, and when the fence came down, it's like, oh, there's quite a lot of, again, green here, and just, but this is what they behaved like, just this, men wielding axes, cutting through a thicket of trees. They smashed all the carved paneling with their axes and their hatchets. They burned your sanctuary to the ground. They defiled the dwelling place of your name. And notice this is part of the daringness of this prayer. They're not saying, God, they ruined our stuff. It's, God, let me show you the reality that they've done to your dwelling place, your people, your sanctuary. And they said in their hearts, we're not just going to do this a little bit. This isn't a slap on the wrist. We will crush them completely. They burned every place where God was worshipped in the land. And now we are given no signs from God. There's no prophets left. And none of us know how long this will be. Imagine chaos, and you don't even know when and how it's going to end. How long, God, will the enemy mock you? Will the foe revile your name forever? Why do you hold back your hand, your right hand? Take it from the folds of your garment and destroy them. It's a gutsy prayer. Almost like calling out God. They look right at the reality and they name it. Remember, things were good, but now look. Even though God worked back then, they return to the present moment, hoping and beckoning, and I don't want to say challenging, although that might be a good word for it, challenging God to act again here and now by walking around the chaos with him. Now, at this point of the psalm, something really interesting happens. Because up till now, all the language is, we have been conquered. The place where we met with you was destroyed. Look what the enemy has done to us in the place that you met with us. And then there's this calling out of God. Why won't you take your hand out of your bosom, the breast pocket, and do something about this? And at this point in the psalm, the voice changes from we and us, and a singular voice stands up. Now it's me and I. And we get the privilege, we get the privilege of reading this psalm, 2,600 years later, where we can look back and remember a time when someone came from the breast pocket, the kolpos, the bosom of the Father, and stood up in the midst of chaos and spoke and did something on behalf of the people. And I don't know that the psalmist had this in mind when they wrote this. But we know in the book of John that in the midst of darkness, the Word of God that was with God in the beginning, that through whom all things were created, came from the bosom, the kolpos of the Father, and revealed God to us. And perhaps with a little bit of imagination, we can wonder if we can hear the voice of Christ standing up at this point of the psalm and saying this: everything's destroyed. The reality is you're in the midst of absolute chaos. Verse 12, but God is my king from long ago. He brings salvation to the earth. It was God who split open the sea by his power. You broke the heads of the monster in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan. Leviathan is the chaos dragon in scriptures. When there was sea and waters and chaos, you broke the head of it. You split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monster in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and gave it as food to the creatures of the desert. It was you who opened up springs and streams. You dried up ever-flowing rivers. And as though to recall that moment of creation, the voice continues, the day is yours, and yours also is the night. You established the sun and the moon. It was you who set all boundaries of the earth. You made both summer and winter. Remember how the enemy has mocked you, Lord, how foolish people have reviled your name. Do not hand over the life of your dove to wild beasts. Isn't that a beautiful thought? God's people, don't hand over this dove to the mouths of wild beasts. Don't forget the lives of your afflicted people forever, but have regard for your covenant, because haunts of violence fill the dark places of the land. Do not let the oppressed retreat in disgrace, but may the poor and the needy praise your name. They've remembered, they've returned, and again, in a daring act of faith, they remind God who he is. Remember, you were the one that faced something like this at the beginning. You were the one who faced something like this when you delivered your people in the Exodus. You were the one who faces chaos, who faces the dragon, who faces scatteredness and brokenness. You're the one that does that, and you can speak newness and creation into this again. It's not unholy or irreverent to remind God who he is. And in reminding God who he is, we also remind ourselves who God is. They remind God, you are actually the king who puts pieces together. When our king fled and another king came to destroy, we are left with one realization, that if there is a good king that we can come under, if there is a good king that can put pieces together, it is God. And the daring act of just reminding God, you are my king. And that's an incredible act of faith. I think of, the times of my life where even my children who, as children sort of, differentiate, as they sort of develop, but I'm thinking of, what's the term, Esther? Differentiation and reintegration, is that right? As children kind of learn, I'm not my parents, but I can trust, or I can even at times challenge my parents. That's a good thing. It is a good, for development, it is a good thing. You don't want this sort of child that is so timid or undifferentiated from you that it's almost like you are in utter control of them. They fear you to the point where they can't even approach you. This psalm, this ability to come. Again, my children from time to time, if I've said something, I'm going to do something, and then I don't do it, they know they can come to me and, but Daddy, you said. They remind me, and okay. Most of the time, it's, okay. Sometimes it's still... It's an act of tremendous faith, a daring act of faith to look at God and say, remember who you are. You're my king, and you can do this. And trusting that he will do this. Again, don't let the oppressed retreat in disgrace. Because the final thing that they do, and they've remembered and they've returned to their present and looked square at it, and they've reminded God who are you, who he is in the midst of this, they make a faith-filled request for God to act. Rise up, O God, and defend, again, your cause. Remember how fools mock you all day long. Do not ignore the clamor of your adversaries, the uproar of your enemies, which rises continually. Rise up, O God, and don't let your name fail. Don't let your kingdom get mocked. We belong to you. You are our maker. You are our creator. You are the putter together of all of these disparate parts. So don't let your kingdom get mocked. It's an act of tremendous faith that God is who he says he is, who he demonstrates himself to be. And we can request from God, rise up in the middle of all this and put the pieces back together.